So I'm very pleased to introduce Bill Moyer. We are very excited to have him here. He's a lifelong activist and musician, and he's the co-founder and executive director of the activist organization called Backbone Campaign. His creative approach to activism has helped raise the visibility of progressive causes and innovating and teaching others in strategic use of artful activism, whether that's with kayaks, spotlights, or giant banners, props, and puppets. Bill has really helped shape a generation of public expression. He really urges change agents to remember that our no is only as powerful as our yes is compelling. And he's going to speak to us today about Solutionary Rail, which is a grand strategic project that leads with a positive vision for the future. Bill lives with his wife and dog in the woods of Vashon Island in Salish Sea, ancestral land of the Puyallup people. So Bill, I'll turn it over to you, and we're very excited to learn more about Solutionary Rail.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to do my best to share the screen. Hopefully all that'll work. It's 8 or so years ago. I didn't know squat about railroads. You know, I thought the thing that progressives should be asking for is bullet trains. I just wanted it to be better, you know, have what other people had. And we were fighting fossil fuel development in the Pacific Northwest with things like kayak activists and such. And in that, I got into a conversation with railroad workers. And one of them handed us a paper that said about the Northern Transcon, the rail corridor between us and you and Chicago, and said, see if you can green this. And a person who cares a lot about building alliances and building power, I took that challenge super seriously and put together a team of people. And in the process, I began a long process of learning a bunch about railroads. And so I'm going to do my best to share. I will provide a link to all of these slides and other things once I'm done in the chat, so that you can go and check it out, because we really realistically don't have enough time. So I'm going to start with a 3-minute video that's a bit old, but it's something that we started with a while back. Let's see if you can hear it.
Solutionary Rail, a people-powered campaign to electrify America's railroads and open corridors to a clean energy future. Our vision is to electrify major rail corridors for faster, cleaner trains that provide a more reliable service for people and goods. We want to draw high-value cargo off of roads and back onto the tracks for highly efficient transportation and near-zero carbon emissions. And we envision opening rail corridors for the transmission of renewable energy, unlocking stranded wind and solar assets, which will not only power the trains, but also the communities they travel to. The United States has the largest economy in the world, yet its transportation infrastructure is overloaded, underfunded, and crumbling. Meanwhile, we are failing to provide solutions for the most pressing environmental and economic needs of the 21st century. The taxpayer-subsidized highway system, built in the 1950s, triggered an exodus of freight and passengers off of the trains and onto cars and trucks, accelerating the decline of U.S. railroads. Rail transport was forced to become increasingly dependent on moving cheap, heavy, and often dangerous payloads with longer, slower-moving trains making fewer stops, and abandoning regular service to the communities that they served. Now, ever smaller crews are forced to work without schedules, on call 24/7, which results in chronic fatigue that endangers workers and trackside communities. Meanwhile, semi-trucks clog ports, towns, and freeways, causing disproportionate wear and tear on our roads, killing thousands each year on freeways, and polluting the air with diesel exhaust. The rest of the world is overcoming these problems by electrifying their railroads. Many countries in Europe and Asia have made massive investments in publicly owned railroads that rapidly transport goods and people. Unlike national railroads of other countries, U.S. freight railroads are almost entirely owned and operated by private companies. maintaining their own tracks, unable and unwilling to make the large, long-time investments for electrification and track modification. Solutionary Rail addresses these challenges through a tax-exempt, not-for-profit Steel Interstate Development Authority, creating a public-private partnership with railroads and other stakeholders to finance, build, and operate the electrification and transmission infrastructure. Our vision champions the needs of numerous stakeholders for rail workers, minimum crew sizes, set schedules, and improved working conditions. For passengers, decreased travel times through higher speed rail networks. For farmers, increased capacity for bulk commodities and faster, more reliable service for moving perishable crops to market. For tribes, right-of-way justice, energy sovereignty, and export opportunities. For trackside communities, reduced air pollution from diesel exhaust. For green energy developers and rural electric co-ops, new transmission opportunities and access to distant customers. For the railroad industry, increased market share of high-value freight and long-term vitality. And for rural communities, an opportunity for access, economic renewal, and cultural vibrance. Solutionary Rail is a people-powered campaign for sustainable transportation and a clean energy future. And now we need you to help move this people-powered campaign forward. Join the team. Learn more at solutionaryrail.org.
So everybody, we really are trying to tackle two overlapping problems. The problem of heavy freight and that contribution to the climate greenhouse gases, and the contribution of our energy sectors. So each are about a third or 30%, with transportation being a slightly larger contributor of greenhouse gases. Now, the hardest part of that transportation pie, though, is not the rail. So yeah, it's cool and it's important around electrification, but those heavy duty vehicles are a key element, and they're the hardest to electrify within the transportation, the land-based transportation. So Solutionary Rail tries to tackle those two pieces with three components, and leveraging the advantages of rail. So trains use a third of the energy. The steel on steel tracks have less friction. Freight move from roads to rail reduces wear and tear and the public expense on the roads, increases safety, improves water quality. We're learning about tire pollution, and getting those diesel trucks off the roads especially increases air quality and public health. All of this, of course, reduces the greenhouse gas emissions. So when what part of the process is understanding, characterizing the problem. And in the United States, we've got a lot of tools out there, but they're not necessarily talking to each other. There is a tool called the Freight Analysis Framework that I started digging into in 2020. And it was really interesting because you can isolate origin, destination, and which mode of transport and what's being transported. It's unwieldy, but it was interesting. And what I found by learning about that tool is there's approximately 1 trillion ton miles. A ton moved a mile. A trillion ton miles of long haul freight that's moving over 500 miles, that's on trucks instead of trains. So it doesn't really make sense, in my mind, to have freight that's moving that far moving on a truck instead of a train, because that's supposed to be the sweet spot, anything over 500 miles for trains. But that's 40% of the long haul traffic is traveling on trucks rather than trains. So that translates into, a lot of wasted diesel, untold amounts because we don't have the right tools, crunching the right data of wear and tear, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really it doesn't make any sense in the public interest to have all that freight traveling, all that long haul freight traveling on trucks instead of trains. So, but we haven't in the U.S. done a good job of characterizing the problem. So I can't tell you right now, like, oh, between Minneapolis and Chicago, or better, from Seattle to Chicago, we know there's a lot of truck traffic and a lot of train traffic, but 40% of, say, is on the trucks. I can't tell you how much that wear and tear is costing people in all those states. I can't tell you exactly, how many lives could be saved by getting those trucks off the roads, et cetera. So we need to do a better job. The European Union is doing a better job. And they have a bigger challenge, right? Because there are all these different countries and the data from those different countries, and yet they're characterizing the problem. And they did something called the internalization handbook that quantifies the impacts of different modes of transportation in a number of ways. And I don't want to get lost in that. So I just want to say that I think that it's super important that the U.S. do the same, and that the freight analysis framework and the USDA's work and the EPA's work and the Texas Transportation Institute's congestion study, that they all talk to each other, and that we put together something like an external cost calculator. Solutionary Rail tried to mock something up, to in our very scrappy way. And we worked with the data scientists, and we put something online that's, I'll share the link later, but it's at external solutionaryrail.org. I'll put the link in later. But anyway, so that's the thing. Characterize the problem and do it according to each corridor, so that we can then say, okay, how are we spending that money? And why is it important to mode shift? Shift the mode that the cargo, the freight is traveling on. Now, of course, a lot of us care about, we all care about passengers too. It's just that, to me, the freight is like this unaddressed issue for a variety of reasons. So we're really focusing on that. We submitted something called the Moonshot Mode Shift to the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis in 2020. And we're saying that, this is a chart, and the 100 to 249, that's about how many miles. These are called distance bands. And so these distance bands are things like the freight analysis framework uses. And so it's putting okay, the dark purple is truck, the lighter blue is rail. So you can see that even at distance bands over 2,000 miles, we've got a significant amount of freight traveling on trucks that really ought to be on trains. So we say, let's make some goals for mode shift. Let's say, okay, let's get rid of 50% of the 100 to 259. Let's mode shift that from roads to rails. Let's 75% of the 250 to 500 mile distance band. And everything above that, let's make it almost impossible for it to go by truck and get it onto trains. Okay, so how do you do mode shifting? What are the ways that happens? You avoid the trucks in the first place by putting on-dock rail, so the ships offload right onto trains. You do roll-on, roll-off technology like they do in Switzerland. You protect short-line railroads and making sure that they can serve the customers and take new freight customers because they're hungry for customers. And you make sure that when you do state rail plans, that the rail plan includes making sure that industrial areas that are served by rail, or they're located, and things like warehouses are located next to tracks, and that they actually use them. So here, this is just a rendering of on-dock rail. This is some examples of roll-on, roll-off. This is an example of trucks that roll onto a train to go through a tunnel in Switzerland, and it's electrified. Switzerland is 100% electrified rail. These are some just other pictures of short line railroads. And one of the things that I had to learn through this process is there's a difference between our railroad companies. We have 7 what they call class 1 railroads, the big ones that have over 250, say, million dollars worth of revenue each year and are usually interstate, they cross state borders. And then you have, and we only have 7 of those, including 2 that are based in Canada. And you have like over 600 of the short line rail and regional railroads. Those short line and regional railroads have a different business model, and we'll get to that, than the class 1 railroads. So I'm not going to get into all the details on that stuff. I'm going to skip to electrification. We still really care about electrification because those tracks and those and electric trains, that power can come from renewable energy instead of diesel. Ultimately, that's going to cost less. Their electric motors have fewer moving parts, so they're cheaper to maintain. You can recapture energy through regenerative braking, and that's not a new thing invented by Toyota Prius. We've been doing the first regenerative locomotive that did regenerative braking was built by GE in 1916 approximately. And we can electrify locomotives. Electrified locomotives actually accelerate and decelerate more quickly. Most of the world is already electrifying most of their main lines. We're the outlier with only 1% of our rail electrified, and that's in the Northeast corridor, mainly for like Amtrak. So mode shift, that's why mode shift is such an important part of the electrification process. Because those trucks, we are getting electric trucks, but those electric trucks are going to cost a lot. We got millions of trucks in the United States, and to shift over the entire fleet to electric is not going to happen anytime soon. It is getting cleaner, and that's a good thing, but it doesn't solve the other problems, which are opportunities for building coalition around the other public impacts like wear and tear, road safety, et cetera, congestion, et cetera. So another reason electrification is super important, even though rail is a small part of the the greenhouse gas impacts, is that those rail yards are principally located around communities of color, and poor people. So what happens is that they and the railroad workers are getting the brunt of the diesel emissions, and so and those allies are not very enthusiastic about shifting more freight to railroads if that's just going to bring more diesel locomotives into their neighborhood. So electrification of rail yards and the electrification of main lines goes hand in hand with mode shift in order to serve our environmental justice allies, and et cetera. And I won't get too in the weeds because our time is short on that stuff, but starting with the rail yards is a big deal. Ports, drayage is the short haul trucks that often take the cargo to a warehouse or to a train. Those, as I said, and then the main lines. Okay. People are starting to hear about battery electric locomotives. So the public helped subsidize BNSF and Wabtec create this battery locomotive, Flex Drive. It's getting a lot of press. The idea is that it's combined with Tier 4, which is a cleaner diesel electric locomotive, and it's added, and it takes up some portion of the power to move a train. That's an okay transition, but it's not the end all. Okay, one of the things that is challenging for those of us who are trying to, solve the climate crisis is that we don't want to unintentionally trade one extraction problem for another, create one foreign policy conundrum for another, trade one waste stream for another waste stream. So we really, I think, should be thinking very carefully about how do we reduce the need for batteries. And so, and that's also why electrifying on a fixed track that you can put overhead catenary lines on that are reached through what's called a pantograph is a super important part of our decarbonization vision, I believe. And so there's another company called Progress Rail, and they're working on like yard and switcher, smaller locomotives that work in the yard. Some of those locomotives are charged when they're not working in what's called a reverse pantograph. You can see this is a bit of a charging station. It reaches down and charges the batteries that are in this locomotive. But what's really cool and what's really, I think, much more of a long-term solution is because we've got 140,000 miles of railroads, and that's not all of the main lines and stuff. The main lines is about 40,000 miles, but even 40,000 miles, electrifying those is not going to happen soon. But if we can start by phasing in the battery electric, and then use the cheapest place to put overhead wires for what they're calling discontinuous electrification. So a lot of this pushback on electrification is, oh, it's cost $5 million of track mile. Well, that's not really true, especially those kind of numbers come from figuring in how much it costs to lift an overpass, how much it costs to deepen a tunnel or replace a bridge. There's lots of places where you can put overhead lines without any, with far less cost. And so starting by doing that and using batteries as a bridge from one section to another seems to me to be a sensible way to crossfade from where we are to where we want to be. So like I said, this is a map of what's called a strategic StratNet. It's a strategic rail network, and like that's 38,000 miles. Some key places are like the major freight corridors, like the Southern Transcon, BNSF Southern Transcon or Northern Transcon. Those are places that I feel particularly connected to. In Europe, they actually have trains that put in the electrification. I can't even, maybe it's a couple of kilometers a day. All right. So the other piece that I started with, the solving the second problem around power, our energy system, is the biggest obstacle to our decarbonizing our energy system is transmission. And so we, in our book and in our work, we've been talking to folks who have ideas around how to solve that through high voltage, very efficient, high voltage DC point-to-point transmission, which when we wrote the book really needed to be over the overhead. Increasingly, it's getting cheaper and cheaper to bury that high voltage DC. So, but if we could take it from energy rich, solar rich parts of the country or wind rich parts of the country and have those sections of the country being exporting energy to other places, that could be cool. So this was a chart done by in the journal Nature by some folks with NOAA who did some modeling of how do you get to 80% renewables by 2030. And the important part is not the little dots, which are forms of generation. The really important part is the lines. Those are the transmission that are joining our various grids. And what's kind of cool, I think, is to look at the density of this is a Amtrak related or passenger rail related map of like key corridors. And you look at that and then you overlay that with the grid map. And you see there's a lot of overlap. The density is just about right. So using corridors for renewable energy transmission, rail corridors should be a priority. And that did actually get into the House Climate Action Plan. So Sioux Green Line is a private effort in your neck of the woods for doing transmission on a rail corridor. It's private. I don't think that's necessarily the direction I would want. I would want a national supergrid personally, but this is just an example of how it's in real world it's happening. There are lots of allies to bring into this cause, I believe. Chronic rural depopulation, rural communities, electric rural co-ops, passengers, communities that have been left behind through the disinvestment from rail over the years. Another important ally are tribes. Whenever you increase use of a corridor, we need to renegotiate the easements. So that's where we have a section in the book called Right-of-Way Justice for Tribes. The small map is Standing Rock, and the bright yellow is the high wind areas. I don't know if anybody went to Standing Rock, but there's at Facebook Hill, there was a lot of wind and it was pretty constant, and that would be way better than a pipeline. Okay, so it seems like everybody should be for this. Like, what's so controversial about this? Well, who could say no? Well, sadly, the Class 1 railroads. The Class 1 railroads are not, don't want anybody to think about them at all. They don't want anybody to tell them what to do. They don't want to do any partnerships. They have any strings attached. And that's kind of lame because they are controlling critical national infrastructure. So I know that we're probably, I should be wrapping up pretty quick, right?
Yep.
Okay. So there's the problem with our Class 1 railroads, they've been taken over by Wall Street. And they're really interested in quarterly profits. They're not making a long-term plan. So their interests and public interests are kind of divergent. And when they were deregulated in the 80s, they were losing money. But now they're banking record profits. And so we really need to be able to collectively take them on. And sadly, here, I'm going to skip a little bit stuff. The Association of American Railroads kind of talks a good game around how great and green railroads are, but they don't actually want to be compelled to do anything about it. So I liken the railroads to like the thing in Jedi mind trick of we're not the droids you're looking for, but I think they're exactly the droids we're looking for. So the public interest is served when interstate rail quality of service attracts and has the capacity to carry 100% of our long haul freight. That freight and passengers travel on electric trains, and that the railroad rights of way are used for a national supergrid. We can re-rate. I want to get to a quick thing like what's happening now. A big thing you'll hear about is common carrier obligations. The common carrier obligations are this long-term idea that the railroads are critical to our society, and they were created in partnership with society. So they have common carrier obligations to serve communities and provide reasonable service for freight and people. And it can't discriminate between a short haul and a long haul. Well, meaning it can't charge more for a short haul versus a long haul. Well, in around 1976 to 1980, we started creating what's called exemptions, service exemptions, commodity exemptions. So now almost very little of except for oil, gas, grain and feed, and certain chemicals are covered by common carrier obligations because even interstate, fruits and vegetables, of course, but intermodal containers are exempted from the common carrier obligations. So positive thing, Chairman Oberman, the Surface Transportation Board, not the Justice Department, the Surface Transportation Board is in charge of controlling the monopolistic powers of the railroads. We did in the fall, we did a letter to him, to Martin Oberman, who's featured here from multiple organizations, because he's actually standing up to the railroads and talking about turning back, revoking exemptions, reestablishing and asserting common carrier obligations for communities and goods. So it's not going to be easy to do this. It's really important, I think, that we have a broad alliance. And that's why the video really emphasizes all those different interests. It's important that we have interagency, all government approach. And I think that there were some opportunities back when, we've been interviewing lots of experts and building that coalition out. But I'm going to skip right to my contact info. A thing that people have done recently, La Crosse passed a resolution for Solutionary Rail. The National Electric Manufacturers Association started a rail electrification council, and with the supply chain crisis, I think people have started to talk about reshoring and look at the limits of globalization. But reshoring means that we have to get smaller manufacturers and smaller farmers access to clean, efficient, reasonable service on rails, which means that we have to prime the infrastructure and reestablish those connections. So I hope that gives you a sense, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bill. Super interesting topic. I think we'll open it up to any questions or comments anyone might have. I see Ken, you
Ken,
asked
yeah,
one.
put one in the chat.
Ken, do you want to speak up, or we can read it out if...
Sure, I can. I stuck one on the chat. I'm just curious who owns the tracks now. And as I was growing up, my dad used to lecture me on how the government picked winners and losers, and the railway system was a much cheaper way to transport goods and people, but the government invested in the interstate highway system to such a high degree that people start driving more, and it was a benefit to the trucks because somebody else was buying the highway. So anyway, I guess the question was, what do you see from the government entities that would correct this? And is there a way to do it privately, or do we have to try to get government involved in building the tracks to do this type of thing?
Great question. So I think that the tracks exist. I think that we can expand and to tracks that we've abandoned a lot. There were about, I think, 240,000 miles, track miles in 1980. Maybe it was 260. There's 140,000 track miles in now. So we probably need to bring some of that rail bank track back into service, to return service to communities that were allowed to be cut off. You're absolutely right around the trucking piece. And I think that it's going to be very challenging because the railroads are super powerful. The trucking industry is super powerful. Even the short lines, they say, we know who brought us to the dance, which, I have a daughter. I don't think that's a very appropriate kind of power relationship, but the short lines are not going to stand up to the Class 1 railroads. And so who is standing up to the Class 1 railroads is shippers. I think if we could do a better job characterizing the problem and the impacts on the public and the cost to the public of this trucking happening on public roads, and our public funding of ports that is really a subsidy for profit maximization, for offshoring transnational corporations. I think we could do a better job making the case. I think this is an area where we can bypass some of the polarization that's happened through culture wars and such, and people who've been left behind by globalization, and start to reshore in a way that is shows solidarity internationally, and also localizes, creates resilient local economies, and supports regenerative agriculture. It's going to be a struggle that we need a combination, but I don't think it's going to happen without public investment. And I think that, honestly, for me, I wish we could just nationalize the railroads and let them run trains, let the private companies run trains, and us harmonize the track infrastructure with the freeway infrastructure, and get a plan for electrifying all of it. But I don't see the politics working out in that direction just yet. But I think first we have to raise the specter of make sure that people understand that freight rail is super important to them. And I don't know if that helps.
Go ahead, Brenda.
Hi, great. Thanks for all the information. I'm gonna have to digest this over time. It's like, what? Okay, I got it. I memorized it all. But really, the in-depth factors, and I'm always interested in this, is like, how have you successfully so far translated this to just the population? Not the people who are going to do the political fights. How can you translate this to, my mom, and so that she can hear this and go, oh my gosh, this is how much it impacts me. Is there anything that's a great tool for that?
Well, I wish. I do think that your mom probably has more stories about trains, just like Ken's dad has
Yeah.
more stories about trains than we do. I think part of the trick is getting those people to tell their stories about trains. I think they are some of our probably best champions for igniting our imagination about how cool it could be for people and stuff to be moved by trains rather than trucks and cars. So I think that's one piece. I think the characterization is a big piece. And then I think it's about building alliances with like railroad laborers threatening to strike, farmers who are, especially family farmers, but farmers and other shippers who want to get things to market, and then supply chain.
Okay. Yeah, because I just wonder, like sometimes what works for me when I'm talking to people about things is like, this is how it's affecting your life right now.
Yeah,
And
right.
that's the one that I always try to find. And so I was just trying to translate this to, I know that there's the carbon effects and there's the, that's number one, but yeah, it's also like, how much does it cost people? Sometimes that, translating it to money.
Right. And that's why I'm pushing for some action at the federal government level to take our sort of prototype external cost calculator and create something real from it, because that's how we actually can do that. It's very within reach. And I think that people definitely have an emotional response to driving on the freeway next to big trucks.
Hey.
Right? Congestion, danger, exhaust. So I think getting trucks off of the road and freight onto tracks is a pretty clear, that's pretty appealing. Problem is, how do you actually do it?
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Tim? I see your hand.
Bill, could you say a few words about your Backbone organization and how you help other organizations promote their causes?
Sure. Backbone Campaign was started by artists who do like giant puppets, and I'm a musician. And so the artists are relatively good at communicating values and vision. And so we helped through the last 20 years make protests more visually, appealing. So what we'll do now is we will either lend imagery or connect artists in communities, or maybe even more almost, I hate to use the word, but kind of propagandistic, like how do you leverage the energy of a few people and make it reach way more folks for little money, and things like, so overpass bannering, we use deer fencing, and we send out banner toolkits to folks. We teach people, we've sent over 60 spotlights. So you've probably seen projections of messages onto buildings. Well, that's from Backbone Campaign 90% of the time. And so that's the kind of thing, is teaching people how to translate their vision and their values into actions that only take a few people. And during COVID, what was an advantage is those were often very COVID safe actions. And people can go to backbonecampaign.org. When I get done talking, I will try to be not very distracting, but I'm going to put some links into the chat, and I'll include that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I think we'll do one more question, and then Bill, if you're willing to stay on after, I think sometimes we usually stay after 7:30 to have more questions, but Steve,
Yeah.
I see your hands raised.
Yes, thanks. Bill, I don't know, maybe this is some sort of myth I heard when I was very young, but there was supposedly, my uncle worked for the railroad. I don't know if he told me it or not, but there was some sort of mystical licenses that railroad companies used to sell to a trucker in order to be able to take more freight on the road. Was that's something that maybe I misheard it wrong, or is there anything truth to that?
I don't know about that. I'm trying to connect the dots on anything sort of esoteric thing that I've heard. What I would say is that one of the excuses for exempting railroads from having to serve communities, their common carrier obligations, was to argue that trucks now do that. We're redundant. We don't need to be competitive in those places, because in the origins of a regulatory system with the Interstate Commerce Commission in like 1887, it was railroads competing with railroads. And to me, honestly, I think that's why I kind of think it should be nationalized, because it's really a natural monopoly, just like the freeway system is a natural monopoly. The fact that we don't account for the social costs of our trucking is causing us, has allowed us to forget the fact that we have this really what I think is a solution hiding in plain sight in terms of the railroads. They are just as relevant or more relevant than ever in this moment of climate catastrophe.
Agreed. Thank you, Bill. Very interesting talk, and go ahead and put those links in the chat, and everyone feel free to follow up. I know there's so much more we could say about the topic, so we really appreciate it.